July 22nd, 2016. The stage is set. Fans turned up in their hundreds. Thousands around the world were watching online. The cheers continued into the night as Sonic Mania was announced. Then, when the hype was at its highest, Takashi Iizuka takes to the stage and says, "Sonic Mania is not Project 2017. The lights dim and a trailer runs. We see destruction, fires, a city in ruins, giant robots stalk the ruins laying waste to everything, and as the trailer fades to dark, fans worldwide are given one instruction: join the resistance." From that moment on, any time Sonic Forces was referenced, promoted, or even leaked, it was the same thing: join the resistance, gather your forces. Images and branding echoing the artistic works of Jim Fitzpatrick and other iconic real-world resistance propaganda began to circulate. This wasn't just a Sonic game in which you were facing Eggman. This was a Sonic game in which you would wage war against Eggman. Even the title Sonic Wars was rumoured to be the original title for the game. The message was clear. This was a Sonic game which would be set in a war which you, the fan, would join and fight. With all the focus and effort to make fans believe this would be a devastating war that they would be fighting in alongside Sonic and his friends, is it so hard to imagine that they would show the effects of this war on the characters? That we would see a very raw representation of the heroes we once loved. Unfortunately for fans, the game came out and it was a bit of a mess. I honestly feel that I could produce an entire video series on Sonic Forces, and why that game is so flawed on virtually every level. From the poor level design and game physics, to just the bad enemy AI, every part of that game is flawed. But even if you ignore the flaws from a design and technical execution, it's flawed from a thematic and characterization perspective. It sets up ideas which it doesn't follow through with, and then some themes just come out of practically nowhere and slap the player in the face as if to say, "This was here all along! Look at our theme, aren't we clever everybody? Hooray!" So with over a year of people talking about Sonic Forces, why make my first game analysis video about that game? Well, one part of the game struck a chord with me when I first played it, and I noticed a lot of people talking about it, but not to the degree or the extent that I saw. I'd like to talk about the character Tails in this game, and why I think there is more going on with his character than many have seen. When Sonic Forces first came out, I saw lots of people comment on the depiction of several characters in the game, and one character which got a lot of criticism was the character of Tails. Many fans of the character were pretty outraged. Some claimed that he'd been dumbed down, and others claimed that he'd been completely retconned into a wimp, or just a complete shadow of his former self. Even people who said Tails wasn't their favourite character believed that the depiction of him in Forces was poorly done. And I too sit in the camp that Tails' depiction was not done very well at all. But unlike most people, my reasons for disliking how the team went about depicting him in this game differ slightly from the majority. Whilst most fans of the character dislike it because it seemed to weaken their favourite character and ignore most of the legacy that this character has built up, when I played Forces, I felt that the writers of the game had tried to portray the character as someone who was suffering from the effects of long-term depression and anxiety. Yeah, that's not what you expect from a Sonic game, is it? But just hear me out. I have my reasons for thinking that, and when looking at this game again, there are just a few clues to suggest that this was their intention. So for the rest of this video, I'm going to look at why this was my initial reaction, and why the game doesn't do a good job at depicting this. But I also want to look at how they could have improved his depiction, done so in a way which would have, in my mind at least, not only just improved the character, but also improved a big part of the overall story. But first, we now go to a small side note. For the last year or so, I personally have been dealing with some serious depression issues. I won't go into detail about my problems for now, But this is part of the reason why, when I first played Sonic Forces and saw the depiction of Tails, something stuck out for me at the time. I felt that there was something going on with Tails, so I looked again at the scenes he appeared in, and felt that there were some signs that at some point they wanted him to represent the mental stress which is associated with war, or be a parallel to what the Resistance itself is going through. So I now want to take a look at this game and the character to try and figure out what's going on, and see if you could forge an argument that he might have some form of depression in this game. However, like I mentioned earlier, Sonic Forces is a bit of a mess. It introduces ideas and then abandons those same ideas out of nowhere, but it also does a very poor job at delivering important information to the player. And one crucial bit of information that's vital to the player's understanding and can radically change how the player views the characters and understand the cast and what they're going through is delivered so badly that the player has no way of understanding it until much later in the game. And what information is that, you might ask? Well, just how bad is the war itself? Imagine you go into Sonic Forces without any prior knowledge of the game. You've never played a demo, you've never watched a trailer, you don't have any knowledge as to what you're about to see. Shortly after the first cutscene, the first piece of information you learn is that the heroes are at war. If someone asks you at this point, how long and devastating has this war actually been? You don't find out the answer to this until quite late in the game. In terms of the length of the war itself, it's very easy to miss because of how poorly it's communicated to the player. In the first cutscene when Sonic is defeated, we see Infinite use a few basic powers. I mean, it sort of looks cool. He bashes Sonic around a bit, he clearly outmatches him. But we don't see anything that would suggest this guy is going to unleash psychological torture. There's no indication of that whatsoever, and we do learn this much later on in the game through a few flashbacks. Our first bit of information that we get about the war comes from a black screen with white text slowly explaining what's going on. And the explanation is very ambiguous. There's no detail over what Eggman has done. We know he's taken over the world, but how exactly has he done this? Has he just placed a few badniks down to ensure he's in control? Or has he levelled entire cities and destroyed its population? Or are the cities and the population fully intact, and he's just appointed himself as dictator with propaganda images all over the place of Eggman's face? Or has he done a little planet and transformed the entire surface into one giant factory, pumping out all of his inventions? We're also not given a firm length of the war itself until the next scene, actually, but this is a throwaway line, which is very easy to miss, and if you miss this one at a time when it tells you how long the war has been, you don't find it out again until after Sonic has been saved, and again it's another throwaway line. We also don't know the impact from an ecological standpoint until we play through several different zones to see what's happened to them compared to how we remember them. This information is crucial as it helps paint the world that the characters are living in, and it can affect their current characterization and the player's understanding and acceptance of any odd changes to those characters. Forces takes too long to show and explain the damage, so this is lost on the player as they've already made their conclusions on the characterizations presented. So let's now go through some of these questions about the war and see if we can paint a picture as to just how bad and devastating it's been. After Sonic is defeated, we're told that Eggman's army quickly took over and that within months, only a few small pockets of resistance remained. This is a really poor way to communicate to the player how long the war has actually been going on for, because when we as players are given a duration of time and it's linked to the length of a war, it changes how we picture every aspect of it. First we're told quickly, so we think, hours, days, maybe a week or two at the most. We now picture a few scenarios that could be related to a war that lasts that long. Eggman just steamrolled everything and took over. Or there was no resistance at all, and Eggman just literally strolled into town, put down a flag and said, "I rule now." The lack of a long duration makes it seem that at least one side had it easy, that they either conquered the other side within seconds, or that there was little resistance at all, and therefore the war wasn't as intense as it probably was. But then we get the word months, and this greatly changes how we picture the war. For instance, we can picture a war in which the resistance did actually put up a huge force to stop Eggman, but it was slowly being chipped away, that they were fighting for a long time, day and night, putting up their forces to stop him, but Eggman was slowly pushing them back, slowly crushing them, until there was barely anything left. But by the use of the words "quickly took over," the player instead gets a picture that Eggman just took over the world in a few days, and that the resistance groups popped up later, and that it wasn't a long time of hard fighting. We do find out that they have in fact been fighting for a while, but Forces again delivers this information very poorly. The exact length of the war is 6 months, and it's given during the next cutscene in a very throwaway moment. If you're not paying attention, you'll completely miss it. The duration of the war should be firmly established. It helps the player paint a picture of the world, and as players, if we're told that a war has been fought for days, months, years, or even decades, we tend to picture those wars differently from each other. We picture how the two sides fared differently due to the length of time associated with it. And this is important information that should have been firmly established, but Forces sadly just doesn't do this. Whilst we can imagine how seeing cities in ruins would impact someone over time, what if they also lived through watching their environment slowly die? During the course of the game, we see that several zones have been destroyed due to ecological disaster, thanks to the war. But Forces undermines itself when trying to show this. For example, the Green Hill Zone has turned to a desert, and this is based off a real-world phenomenon called desertification, which can happen during either an environmental catastrophe or due to man-made pollution and poor farming techniques. So huge points to the developers for researching and actually implementing this. However, this also undermines the impact of the war itself, because whilst we're led to believe that the desertification process has happened due to the fact Eggman has taken over, the first time we see the Green Hill Zone happens before Eggman takes over. And the implication here is that Eggman just had the power and the ability to always do this, regardless as to how much of the world he controlled. But let's ignore that plot hole for now. We also see evidence of a major climate change as the chemical plant zone is completely frozen over, and we assume that this has been caused by an increase in pollution caused by Eggman's factories and machines, effectively blocking out the sun. In fact, every zone we enter has been tainted in some way, but by the time the player can see that the impact isn't just localized to one or two areas, Classic Sonic goes to the Resistance HQ, and everyone is happy as a clown. The physical impact of the war is one of the few cases where the game explains itself very well. From the outset, it's clear absolutely nowhere has escaped. The physical impact has taken its toll on both the natural and man-made world. In terms of destruction, it's global. There's no escape from it. We see giant mechs destroying huge cities. We see fleets of spaceships dominating the orbit around the world. And we see the Death Egg looming down from space. It's mass destruction, which has been ongoing for 6 months. Think about that. All the characters for 6 months have been battling Eggman's machines day and night, watching their cities crumble, their environments collapse. That's going to affect you. Regardless as to how tough you are, that is going to affect you in some way. But there isn't just the reaction to the physical impact and stress of the war. Eggman isn't just engaging in physical warfare. He's not just destroying stuff, he's not just hitting you, he's not just hurting you. He's also got a very powerful psychological weapon in the form of Infinite. When you look at him through a critical eye, Infinite is a bit ridiculous. He's got more powers than the game knows what to do with, and it just looks a bit daft how you can defeat him so easily in every encounter, despite the fact he has all these incredible powers and abilities. But if you put that aside for just a moment and look at what he actually does in this game and to all the other characters, he's quite terrifying. Let's get the elephant out of the room first. Infinite kills people during a flashback sequence. There's a flashback sequence later in this game in which we see a group of resistance fighters taking on Infinite, and Infinite kills them. Oh, you might think, there's nothing to suggest they're actually dead, they might just be knocked out. No, there are lots of cases where both Infinite and the other characters say that Infinite did indeed kill those people, and that the Avatar was the only survivor of that fight.
All except for this brave kid, who survived the battle and made it here in one piece.
Infinite also claims that he will kill again, multiple times during the game.
Dear trembling child, I'm going to fight and die here.
Knuckles, what's the sit-rep, Commander?
Happy to see you're all still alive.
Even if you don't want to believe that they're dead, Infinite tells the soldier that he will let him live if he runs away in terror to tell others what's happened here. Infinite is making the survivors of his attacks run away and tell the tale of how powerful and unstoppable he actually is.
Reporting that whatever it is that finished Sonic has got them running in fear.
That's a powerful psychological weapon in itself. Later, we see how Infinite is able to use his powers to spread fear and confusion, attacking people not just on a physical level, but on a mental one too. During the level Capital City, it starts like any other city level that we've seen in many Sonic games. But then, very quickly, Infinite triggers the Phantom Ruby and begins full-on psychological warfare against both the player and the entire Resistance. The world begins to warp, gravity switches, the player is left feeling disorientated. Even Eggman makes a comment to suggest that this series of attacks is designed to crush their will to live.
Make them wish they'd never been born!
Despite Knuckles telling the Resistance that what they're seeing is not real, we quickly discover that the entire Resistance army is collapsing before nearly 80% of it is completely wiped out.
Reinforcements! This is Foxtrot! We can't hold out much more!
80% of our forces have been wiped out, and we've lost contact with the rest!
One flip of the Phantom Ruby switch and everything falls apart on us!
But it's not just the warping of space and time. Infinite is able to create giant twisted versions of himself. They resemble titans destroying the world around them. But for me at least, they remind me of the demons you see in Bloodborne, or demons from some kind of Lovecraftian universe who forever torment our world. So this war, which has been raging for 6 months, has not only seen global destruction, which has resulted in crumbling cities, thousands dead or knocked out, ecological disaster, but also psychological torment, which involves people seeing their reality being warped, twisted, and illusions of demonic-like visions for 6 months.
Tails has just lost it.
Whilst the intention of this video is to examine Tails and to see whether or not the war has had an effect on him, we could just easily brush it aside or claim, meh, it's not intentional, if Tails is indeed the only one feeling this way. But if other characters are also showing signs of stress and fatigue, then suddenly it gives more weight to the argument that somebody on the development team wanted to show the physical and mental consequences of living in this environment for such a long period of time. And there are in fact some other characters in the game that are showing signs that the war is getting to them. The first clue comes right at the start of the game, when we're introduced to Vector. In virtually every previous game, just think about how Vector is introduced. He's a loud, eccentric character with lots of energy. When he's not listening to heavy rock music, he's stamping his authority of being the boss, the leader of the Chaotix Detective Agency. But how is his first appearance in Forces? He slowly walks into the room. He looks tired. His eyes are heavy, his hand is on his head. He looks almost defeated, both physically and mentally, as he tells the room, Eggman's army is unstoppable. He then gives a report about how the people are losing hope and giving into despair. And this shows that it's not just the main cast of characters that are feeling the effects of the war. Everybody is. Both the NPCs and Tails are described as suffering so badly that they just cannot fight back. The war has had such an effect on them, they're mentally and physically exhausted, and this is primarily down to the psychological impact brought on by Infinite's tactics. So now that we've looked at the 6-month war, we have a much better understanding as to what the characters have been living through for more than half a year. They've been battling near night and day. They've been pushed to the brink of destruction, facing giant mechanical robots and nightmarish demonic illusions that appear to be warping time and space. They've been battered and beaten, both physically and mentally, for 6 months, as they've watched their friends destroyed and environments slowly dying. This has been a long and costly war, with little hope and fight left in those who still oppose Eggman. We now need to take some time to look at Tails himself, in order to fully understand his character and why he acts the way he does in Sonic Forces. Tails has been in the Sonic universe for over 25 years now. In that time, even if we only focus on canon video game material, the character will naturally undergo some changes. Look at virtually any long-running video game series. The characters change. If we look at just the classic era of games, Tails was a hero that was on par with Sonic and Knuckles, but we also see that he stands separate from the other characters just by his experience with being a pilot and expert mechanic. And when we move to the 3D era, we see that his expertise as a mechanic and inventor have been kept. But in terms of him being capable as Sonic, this has toned down a little. His entire story arc in Sonic Adventure almost feels like he's trying to prove himself, that he can step out of Sonic's shadow, and this is reflected in his gameplay. It's all about racing. You're trying to beat someone else to the end of the stage. You compete against someone. You try to prove that you are faster or better than they are. Even when he's fighting the final boss and the eventual victory music when you beat it, it's all about finally breaking free and standing strong on your own. Despite this, his role in video games since then has been gradually toned down and down per installment, and by the time we get to Sonic Unleashed, it's weighed far more towards mechanical and technical support. His function as a primary fighting hero has been put aside now for well over 10 years. And that's okay. No, really, it is. When you have a series which started out with one hero, who gradually increases his heroic friends and partners, there becomes a problem that you can suddenly find yourself in, with lots of characters who are on par with the main hero doing exactly what they do. This can start to make the main hero look less special, and if you have a threat that the main hero needs help with, and there's a huge cast of characters to pick from, you have to either raise the stakes to stupidly high levels, such as the whole world or universe will be destroyed, or artificially make the cast appear weak right from the outset in order to make a minor villain appear more threatening. Otherwise, your audience starts asking, how come these characters are equally as epic as one another, yet they can't deal with this threat until 10 levels down the line? But if you have a hero stable where one character is the primary hero and the others specialise in something that they can't do, you start to create a more rounded group that has to, if you'll excuse the pun,
Superpower of teamwork!
in order to get the job done. So we're in a position now where Tails' role is more clearly towards supporting character, despite taking on major villains and being a core hero in the past titles. We still have those memories, but Tails is, for lack of a better word, retired to that of a more supportive character. And in my mind, that's okay. Same with the other cast. So to summarise Tails, whilst he can take on badniks and bosses if he absolutely has to, he's primarily an accomplished inventor and scientist. He's capable of creating some fantastic machines, which in our world are pure science fiction. He uses his knowledge to solve problems and help weaken threats brought on by Eggman in order to give his friends a tactical edge. It's stated in various documentation that his IQ is on par with Eggman, and we've seen him create artificial intelligences and demonstrate a keen analytical and logical mind that's capable of solving complex problems at a high mathematical level. He might not fight directly on the front line, but his best weapon is now his creative technical mindset, and that's a problem? So before we look at Tails in Sonic Forces, we should take some time to look at the symptoms of depression in order to get a clearer understanding as what it is we're looking for when we look at Tails in this game. It should be said that one does not need to have all these symptoms in order to be diagnosed with the condition, so I won't be listing everything, just a few which I think could apply, and this information comes from the National Health Service and is correct as of January the 8th, 2019. So now what we need to do is look at Tails in Sonic Forces and see if his character displays any of these signs. From the outset, when we first see Tails in Sonic Forces, it's pretty poor. He's cowering in fear because there are some egg robos advancing towards him. I want to say that he's actually protecting the citizens, but he's not. Look, he's cowering. It doesn't look good at all, especially when you consider that only 3 of the robots are actually advancing towards him. The other 6 are advancing towards an empty wall. And then Sonic comes in and saves the day. So why is this scene so bad? Well, whilst the Tails section is very small, it's still very poorly done. Even for a character which is being switched to a more supportive role, it just makes Tails look bad. It makes him look no better than the NPCs he's protecting. Having Tails show this much fear early on does several things which actually harms the plot of Forces in the wider scale of things. The first point, it lessens the impact of the war against Eggman, because showing this much fear early on displays that Tails was always going to react the way he did, instead of the war having a major effect on this once loved and respected hero over time. The second point, it lessens the threat of Infinite. I mean, who needs powerful psychological terror weapons when you can just bring a few egg robos and a main cast member will just crumble to his knees? And the final point, he becomes a stereotypical damsel in distress. In Forces, he's the only character other than the generic NPCs that needs directly rescuing. Twice. And the sad part about this is that there's a really simple way to improve this scene, yet still have it end in virtually the same way. Don't just have Tails cowering. Have him standing there, maybe putting his arms to his side, showing defiance, trying to protect the citizens. Even Slimer got it right in the Ghostbusters cartoon. The simple fix here is don't have him cowering this early in the game. Have him showing some defiance. Even if he doesn't try to take on the robots, just give us something to show that he was going to, or at least try to defend the people, and not just cower and be waiting to be captured. But the scene goes on, and we see Sonic get defeated and captured, and Tails doesn't do much other than to try and get readings on Infinite. And for a lot of fans, they were angry that Tails just stood by and did nothing to help or rescue Sonic. And I, for one, think his actions here are perfectly fine and justified. No, really, I'm not just saying that to try and take some opposite, ooh, I know more. Let me explain my thinking here. Tails not engaging and effectively running away after Sonic is defeated is completely fine and justifiable. Now, some people might say, but Tails has taken on both Eggman and Chaos on his own. That's right, he has. On their own, and in the environment of a final boss or major boss of a single game. He, like Sonic, has never tried to take them all on at once, let alone all the other characters that appear in this fight. At this time in the game, Sonic doesn't know their illusions. He thinks they're the real thing, and he's defeated in seconds. So what chance did you think that Tails has? Especially considering his role in the series is being reduced to a more supportive character. Just think if Tails had got involved here, and he was defeated also. Do you think Eggman would have just left him there? He probably would have captured him as well. And another reason why Tails doesn't get involved, Sonic just doesn't want him to. At no point does Sonic ask Tails for help, other than with his readings. In fact, later in the game, Sonic tells Tails to stand back when it's just Eggman and Infinite. Sonic himself does not want Tails in direct harm's way. Even if Tails had tried to take on the Egg Robos from the start, does anyone here honestly think he could have defeated Eggman, Chaos, Shadow, Zavok, Metal Sonic, and Infinite at the same time? Running away at this point makes sense for several reasons. Whilst we don't see what happens next, we can imagine it. Sonic is defeated, Eggman is able to capture and imprison him. Odds are Infinite goes along with him, along with the illusions of villains. Eggman wouldn't want to take any chances. So what does Tails do at this moment? Whilst we don't know for sure, I would like to think that he has the sense to warn the other heroes, and he tells them what's happened, that all these other villains appeared and defeated Sonic, and that there's a new powerful villain with them. He at least gives the heroes time to prepare. Otherwise, Eggman may have completely succeeded, to the point where there was no resistance at all. If we put aside Tails cowering from the Egg Robos, Tails doesn't act too badly in the opening sequence. It makes sense in terms of where his role has been heading in the Sonic series, and doesn't do anything outside of his normal behaviour. When Infinite first appears, he's quick to act. He tries to figure out what's going on, but Sonic has told him just get readings on him, not to get involved in the fight. He's showing no signs of a lack of confidence. The issue here is that he's never seen anything like it before. He's trying to figure out what's going on, but he can't. The problem is not a lack of ability. The problem here is a lack of a frame of reference to understand what the readings are telling him. There is nothing in the intro to suggest he's any different from the character that we've known from the last few years. If it wasn't for him cowering in front of those Egg Robos. And this is why I think that cowering scene was such a mistake. It's a second long, but it overshadows Tails completely in this scene, because it undermines everything else he does, despite his actions being completely justified in this opening sequence. So right up until the start of the 6-month war, Tails seems to be coping fine, and showing no signs of depression in any way, as we should expect at this point. After this scene, we get the text description, which we've already talked about at length. We've now established that the war has raged for 6 months, and from our analysis earlier in the video, we now know that it's been a very destructive war on a physical, ecological, and psychological level. Tails, who is only 8 years old, has been living in this war environment for 6 months. We now move on to the Resistance meeting. Following the defeat of Sonic, we get our first clue that Tails is not doing well. During the Resistance meeting, Silver delivers a very unflattering line.
Gone, Amy. And Tails has just lost it.
Tails has lost it. I don't know about anyone else, but what's the first thing that you think of when you hear that someone has lost it and they're not talking about their phone? It's not exactly the most flattering way to describe someone's mental state, is it? It's a really poor negative stereotype. But in the context of the game itself, this is a really bad choice of words, and the time it's delivered is also really poorly done. The line comes mere moments after Tails sees Sonic defeated, and the characters talking about how they miss Sonic. The player has also only just seen Tails cower in front of egg robos, and the negative reception is further enforced by the poor text description seen earlier. The player has no context right now for how devastating the war has been. Therefore, when you add all this up, the implication is that Tails has lost it because he saw Sonic defeated, despite the fact he's seen Sonic defeated a few times in previous games and reacted in almost a more defiant and vengeful-like stance. Combine all this together, and Tails comes across very poor. It's no wonder some fans reacted as negatively as they did. Now, there is a way that they could have improved this scene, but we'll come back to that later in the video, because the next scene that we see Tails in directly ties to this. It's quite an important scene, because we actually see for the first time Tails during the 6-month war, and we should get the full context of what Silver actually means. The first time we actually see Tails during the 6-month war is when he's outside of the safety of the Resistance HQ. He's trying to fix Omega, his tools are scattered around, suggesting at least he's brave enough to be outside during daylight. He's at risk here, and he's trying to help his friend. And that's good. But the problem is, he can't fix Omega and says it's because I wasn't smart enough. Tails, you have made a jet that can transform in flight. You have made a walking battle tank. You made yourself a device that could decode an alien language and countless signal trackers, an energy analyzer, and if we take the non-canon Sonic and the Dark Brotherhood, you have shown that you can repair Omega when he breaks down. So with all that in mind, you lot should probably think that this scene and this line are both perfectly fine. I can already hear some Tails fans sat there screaming, "What? How could you say that? We know he's smart enough to fix this." Well, it all goes back to what I said right at the start of the video about dealing with a form of depression. We'll talk about this more in a little while. But as someone who is currently going through this, I can say with absolute confidence that having depression can make tasks which you used to excel at or find relatively simple much harder to do. Not just physical activities, but mental ones as well. It can affect your memory and your ability to work out both logical problems and computational problems. So you can imagine how it would affect someone trying to fix a robot with its own artificial intelligence logic systems. For someone to say, "I can't do this, I'm not smart enough," when we know they can, it isn't wrong or inaccurate from their perspective. As someone outside who has seen their abilities, we know what they're saying is wrong. We know they are smart enough. We know they can usually do this. But from their mental stress, what they're saying is correct. They're so stressed and they're so down. They genuinely can't do it. The next major Tails moment occurs in the same scene, when he's confronted by Chaos. Tails begins to panic and begs for Sonic to save him. And even I have to admit that this scene is actually okay, to a point. Tails panicking at the sight of Chaos is fine. And I know what you're thinking, I can hear you screaming it out, but he actually faced Chaos in Sonic Adventure, a more powerful version of him, so this version should be easy for him to defeat. And If this game was set immediately after Sonic Adventure, I would say you're right. You're absolutely 100% right. But remember what we established earlier. Over the last 10 years, Tails has been moving more towards a supportive role, not that of a primary hero. And what is Chaos? He's supposed to be a powerful, godlike villain, not easy to take down, even in his basic form. And looking at this scene in the context of Tails stepping down from that position of a powerful primary hero, it does make a bit of sense for him not to be able to take on Chaos. So is the reaction justifiable? Yes, except for one part.
Sonic, help me!
Crying out for Sonic. One of the many problems that Sonic Forces has is its narrative structure is a bit of a mess. The player believes that the 6-month war began after Sonic was defeated, but we see Tails react almost the same to how he does when he meets Chaos to how he reacted to the Egg Robos, which occurred before the 6-month war began. To the player, and especially fans of the character, these two responses cements the thinking that Tails has been retconned into a complete wimp in order to make Sonic appear to be some kind of saviour to the masses. Crying for Sonic is going to make most people roll their eyes. They probably shouldn't have included that line and just have him either cry out for help or simply just backing away quietly in fear. So why is this reaction justifiable if the game has structured everything to this point to make it so poor a scene? Well, I think it's justifiable for two reasons. The first being that the game itself doesn't let the player understand the full concept of the 6-month war until much later on. We have no reference of the scale of destruction or torture that everyone has endured. We have no frame of reference to understand why Tails is so afraid. Until we fully understand what the characters went through, we just simply lack the knowledge to understand why is Tails so frightened. The second reason, if we look at the theory that he does actually have depression in this story, and we'll come to this a bit later on, Tails being frightened is justifiable. He would be experiencing a major lack of confidence in himself and his ability, especially when you consider that he's now also a supportive character. But screaming out for Sonic, it's very cringy and eye-rolling no matter how you try to look at it. The biggest problem with him crying out for Sonic is that the player is just smart enough to see through it. We know it's just done to signify classic Sonic's arrival and begin a theme which Sonic Forces never follows up with, the everything happens for a reason theme. So after this scene, we should probably look at what happens to Tails in the rest of the game, but there is absolutely no point in doing so. Sonic Forces is so poor and it's so badly done that after classic Sonic enters the game, Tails is effectively cured of whatever was wrong with him. It's astonishing how poorly this change happens. The moment Tails just looks at classic Sonic, he shows confidence, his ability to work is fine, he's active in the resistance, he's planning strategies, he has energy, he has motivation, he's completely the opposite of everything the game tried to do to his character at this point, and we're only about 10 minutes into the game. This is really bad for several reasons, but the main reason is that this scene effectively tells the player that just the sight of classic Sonic can solve all the problems someone is going through. That you don't have to work through it. It doesn't take effort. It doesn't take time. Just looking at classic Sonic's smug face is going to solve all of your and all of the world's problems. In fact, the turnaround is so complete that there is barely any point in looking at Tails for the rest of the game, outside of one or two moments. The first being when he meets modern Sonic again, and the second being at the very end of the game, where the writers practically force the player to swallow an environmental message that comes out of nowhere, whether they like it or not. We can assume that it was Tails who eventually fixes Omega. But again, the game handles this very poorly. We don't see him do it. And it's a shame because they could have greatly improved this and actually tied it into the gameplay if they had just tried. So now we move on to the big question, which, if true, would explain a lot of Tails' character in this game. Is Tails suffering from depression? We've gone through how the game does a poor job in showing the player a lot of key information early on. The player has to wait to be shown just how devastating the war has been on the planet and the people living on it. It also very poorly handles the showcasing of the characterization of the main cast to the player. We don't understand what they're going through during our playthrough because the game withholds information and then it presents it later very poorly unless we sit back and really study it. If there is some evidence to suggest that Tails does have depression, how could the developers have improved this characterization without sacrificing the decision to give him it? Earlier on, I listed some of the symptoms of depression, so let's now go through the scenes where Tails does appear, or is at least mentioned, and see if any of these symptoms could potentially apply. This one is easy. Who apart from Charmy and possibly Knuckles isn't suffering from low mood? We first see the Resistance HQ. Vector looks drained and worn out. Amy is also down, and we also get told that virtually every NPC in the game is losing hope and giving into despair. The only characters who are not showing this are Silver, who seems to be trying his best to mask his emotions with a sense of duty and urgency, and Charmy. Even when Knuckles mentions Sonic, everyone's face drops. They're all feeling it. Tails himself even comes close to admitting that he's feeling low when he tells Sonic that he was so worried for the last 6 months. This is hard to pin down on an exact point with reference to Tails, but again, I'd have to say yes, he is suffering from this. Because as with the low mood, we get lots of exposition telling us that everyone feels hopeless and helpless. We also get a few lines from the characters explaining how everyone is terrified, suggesting there's very few people left with the hope and the will to fight, which is why Buddy is the only character we see in the entire game who joins the Resistance. But the biggest clue, it comes from Vector. One of the first lines he says in the game is, "Everybody is losing hope due to the lack of Sonic." Virtually everyone in the game is feeling hopeless and helpless, even if they don't outright state it. This links to another symptom which I'll cover soon, but it's very easy to point out. There are two obvious moments, but one is undermined by the scene that happens before the 6-month war began. The first is how Tails can't fix Omega, and pretty much shoots himself down for not being smart enough. And the second is him cowering from chaos and crying for help. He doesn't believe he's smart enough to solve a problem, which he knows he should be able to, hence the "that should have done it" and "I'm not smart enough." The way he reacts to chaos and the cowering shows the lack of confidence in himself, both not to fight back or to make an escape attempt. He literally freezes in place. Add on to this the fact that he's quite harsh on himself for not being able to fix Omega. It does seem that he's suffering from low self-esteem and confidence. I've already talked about why Tails not trying to save Sonic was a smart move, and why running away was also the right thing to do. But that doesn't mean he wouldn't feel guilty about doing so. Look how he reacts the first time he meets modern Sonic. It's really cringy. He's obviously felt really bad for leaving Sonic, hence the worry, and for 6 months he's been thinking about what's happening to Sonic, or is Sonic even still alive? And since he was the only one there who saw what's happened and could have done something to stop it, you can bet he's probably feel guilty about what happened. And if you wanted to be really harsh, had Tails actually done something and managed to save Sonic, the entire 6-month war may never have even happened. If Tails does have depression, due to how illogical it can be, and how illogical it can make your thoughts, you can bet that this definitely crossed his mind. We have numerous examples of this. Silver's charming lost it line, how he cowers at chaos, and the fact he openly admits that he's been so worried. There's countless examples. He's definitely feeling anxious and worried. We have a few examples here that are not immediately obvious. The first is from Silver's speech to the Resistance. Tails has lost it. We have to do it without them. The work here is fighting Eggman. Tails is in such a state that they can't rely on him to help them. And then we see evidence of this. What should be a simple task for Tails, that of fixing Omega, he struggles with, and when he can't do it, he just completely gives up. Okay, I can imagine in the 6-month war, there aren't many tea parties or outings to the beach. But when we see Tails after the Resistance's meeting, he's working alone. Nobody is with him, and he never makes contact with the Resistance until after he returns to the base with Classic Sonic. Combine this with what Silver says about how we have to do it without them. It does strongly hint that Tails hasn't been at the Resistance HQ for a while, and he's trying to avoid being around his friends. He's just muddling on his own. He's trying to get through everything on his own accord. He isn't going with his friends. He's not hanging out with them. He's not working with them. He's really struggling on his own. So I'm now going to talk about the structure of the game and the narrative structure of Tails himself to see if it does somehow reflect or parallel someone who is going through depression and trying to get support and help for it. Sometimes when we read books or watch films and play certain games about war and conflict, we find that they tend to be structured in a way which reflects the mental state of a certain character, normally the hero or the protagonist, or even non-war titles like the Dark Souls games. How the game presents the journey of the character tends to mirror the mental state which that character is going through. And does Sonic Forces do this? Does it mirror someone who experiences depression and the support for it? When someone believes that they have depression, they normally react in one of two ways. They either immediately get support from friends, family, and medical professions in order to help them through it, which, according to the NHS, often results in a much quicker recovery time. Or they become introverted and they try to muddle through it on their own. And sadly, this is the most common reaction that most people have. The response, whilst not impossible to achieve, is far harder and often more dangerous to them. And sadly, many people who respond in this way don't find the successful resolution that they were wanting. So now look at Tails in this game. During the Resistance opening cutscene, we learn that he's not being himself. He's spending more time away from them. And when we first see him, he's working outside. He's on his own. He's trying to muddle through things on his own, trying to muddle through fixing Omega. His tools are scattered around everywhere. He doesn't look organised. He doesn't look confident. He's on his own trying to do it, and it doesn't work. The next big change for him comes after Classic Sonic arrives. The pair spend time together, and Tails' confidence and mood clearly improves. Granted, this is done badly. The effect is way too fast, but the impression does seem to be that with the help and support of a close friend, Tails was able to get better. And just think about what happens after Classic Sonic arrives and Tails spends time with him. The pair don't immediately go back to the Resistance HQ. They go off together slightly on a journey. They spend time fighting bosses, going through zones, And the implication here could have been that if Tails hadn't immediately become cured, all these small victories, going through zones, defeating badniks, defeating a boss, would have raised his confidence and ability. And then when we see him much later in the game, he's gradually getting better and better and better until the final resolution. But there is another strong parallel to the healing process when someone has depression in this game. Now, the advice is, when you have depression, to take things slow, to make small victories and do small things which gradually help build your confidence up until you can do much bigger things at the time which you thought were impossible. Now, when you start this thinking and apply it to the events of the game, the entire plot is about making small victories against Eggman. They can't just overthrow him. They have to do smaller stuff first beforehand. Blowing up Eggman's Green Hill weapons plant. They've stopped him from making new weapons. Causing distractions. They move his forces away from the chemical plant. They can now infiltrate the chemical plant and take that down. Before finally confronting Eggman. They can't just attack directly. Anytime they've tried that, and when we actually see them do that in the game, they've failed. They have to build up these smaller victories with the help of themselves and their friends. They have to work to overcome smaller tasks before they can overcome the impossible task. As I said at the start, I'm not a doctor. But looking at these symptoms and then looking at what's going on in this game with Tails, he's certainly displaying a lot of the symptoms for depression. It's not hard to believe that he could be suffering from the effects of depression, brought on by a combination of his guilt from leaving Sonic and what he's witnessed and seen during the 6-month war. And if you believe this theory, then it could go a long way to explain why he acts so out of character during the Omega and Chaos scene. However, due to the poor writing and decisions made in the scene before the war, this is lost on many players, and it seems like it was almost an abandoned idea because they were either too afraid to go through with it, despite the fact they could have almost perfectly tied it to the main story's narrative and been a really good subtext for the player. So if by now you're willing to accept that Tails may have depression, or at least willing to accept the possibility that he might have it, I'm now going to spend some time talking about how they could have gone ahead with this idea and improved it without sacrificing too much, and even link it to the main plot of the game itself, without actually changing too much of the storyline. So we start with the Egg Robo scene, and the first big fix they could have done here is so simple and easy. Tails shouldn't cower. He should at least be trying to protect the civilians. He needs to react similar to how he does in this scene at the end of the game. He shouldn't be showing signs of total fear at this point. The war hasn't even begun yet. We need to see that he has far more confidence than he does after the 6-month time jump has passed. Otherwise, the rest of this scene is okay. So now we get to our next scene, which is the very badly done story device, telling the player what's happened. For the player, this description is far too ambiguous. There is, however, a really obvious fix for this. Don't make it a black background. If you must have text on the screen, overlay it on some footage showing Eggman's army destroying the world. We had a teaser trailer with some footage showing that. Show us Infinite creating his demonic-like illusions. Show us the resistance groups fighting and running in fear. I'm in two minds over changing Silver's line in the Resistance HQ meeting. On the one hand, I think Lost It does paint a picture that something is wrong with him, but if you change it to something like Sonic is gone and Tails, he's just a shadow of the person we once knew. This suggests that Tails has changed during the 6 months, and if you add this line with the changes to the blank text scene, the player would get a much clearer understanding as to why Tails has changed. Another big change I would do, and this would be a big change for the rest of the game, Omega should be in the corner of the Resistance HQ. There should be a clear section in this room where Omega is, and it looks as if he's being worked on. During the meeting, one of the characters should probably comment on how Tails is having a hard time trying to fix him. He's out now looking for spare parts. Why have Omega in the base? Aside from the fact it just makes more sense having him there than outside in the open where they're vulnerable. Omega could be used as a clever device to help showcase the player's progression and Tails' efforts overcoming his demons in the game. I'll explain this in just a moment. When Chaos encounters Tails, he can still cower and be afraid, but don't scream out, "Sonic, help me." The player can see through this as just a way to introduce classic Sonic. Ideally, don't have him say anything. Just make it appear as if he wants to stand up to him, but he's too scared to. I mean, the game actually does this later on when Buddy encounters Infinite later in the game. Another big change: after Classic Sonic saves the day, instead of Tails suddenly being cured and his confidence instantly being restored, have Tails tell Sonic that he feels bad for not being able to fight back against Chaos, or that he's having no luck fixing Omega, and that he feels like he's letting everyone else down. This would show the player that Tails is not okay, that he's doubting himself and that he's having problems. And at this point, I would have Classic Sonic either help him pick up the parts that he was looking for, like imagine he drops them when Chaos encounters him, or just simply placing his hand on his shoulder and showing him some kind of moral support. Just by doing this one simple thing, it would not only show to Tails that he is worth something to someone, but it would also show to the player just how good friends Sonic and Tails actually are. Sonic can see that Tails isn't well and that he's feeling very upset, and he just wants to help his friend. So after the Tails and Chaos scene, I think the idea that they don't go straight to the Resistance HQ, but they actually do go to the Green Hill Zone, and they go through that stage and defeat Eggman, is very important to Tails' recovery. Like I mentioned earlier, it shows Tails getting support from a good close friend, they're getting some small victories, defeating badniks, defeating a boss, and it helps build his confidence. But when they return to the Resistance HQ, this is where I think the developers could have done something very special if they wanted to. For the rest of the game, except the final battle, Tails should remain at the Resistance HQ, trying to fix Omega. From this point on, any time we return to the Resistance base, we should see Tails trying to fix Omega in the background. Each time we return here, he's made more progress. For example, maybe Omega's fingers can clench into a fist. Maybe his head can move slightly. Just something which shows that progress is being made. Each time we see him or hear him in the radio chatter as the game progresses, as the player beats more stages, as the Resistance has more small victories, like the player, like the Resistance, Tails is growing more in confidence. He's not doubting himself as much anymore until he eventually becomes the hero we know he can be. In fact, for the final battle, show him coming to the battle with Omega. Don't just have Omega arrive out of nowhere. Show that it was clearly Tails who repaired him. And if you wanted to show this more without a shadow of a doubt, imagine if every time the game loaded, it read your save file, which would show your progression beyond the Tails and Chaos scene. Instead of the standard title screen, we see the Resistance HQ, and we see Omega there, and we see Tails there fixing Omega, and depending on your progress in the game, Omega shows more signs of life. This would tie Tails' recovery directly to the player's progress throughout the game. And that would be a far more interesting, a far more engaging gameplay mechanic for the player, and the player doesn't have to do anything other than actually play through the narrative. So, would doing all these fix the game? Oh my, no. No. Sonic Forces at its core is still pretty bad. From the level design to the game physics, everything is so poorly done. Even narratively speaking, during this video we talked about Infinite. He has all these incredible, terrifying powers, but we didn't talk about the fact, despite having all these powers, the majority of the game he throws cubes at people and spouting melodramatic lines which are so ridiculous, it undercuts how threatening he is. My goal here was to look at Tails. I've seen so many articles and so many videos from people saying how bad he was in Sonic Forces, so I wanted to look at him and look at the game overall to see if there was something going on, because I couldn't believe they just wrote him that badly. I wanted to see if there was something else here going on, and I think there might be. If you disagree with me, that's fine, but as someone that's actually going through this problem myself, I did see signs that there was an idea here at least an idea that someone wanted to go along with this, and that they did for a short time, but for some reason they either got scared or didn't feel they had the ability to pull it off, so they just completely abandoned that idea. But even if you restored this, or if you accept this, Sonic Forces is still pretty poorly done. But I would have hoped that if you've made it to the end of this video, you can now at least look at Tails and see the potential for his character, as well as the potential that this game could have had, that this game nearly did try to be a bit more grown up, and how you can make it more engaging to the player by some very minor changes, or even just by how you present information to the player in this game. It can radically change their impressions of a game, even if they don't realise it has or don't understand how it has. So I hope you at least come away with that. Thanks for listening, guys. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again next time. Goodbye.
Hey guys, if you liked this video and would like to continue the adventures, please follow me on Twitter or Instagram. Links to both can be found in the video description. If you'd like to help support the channel, why not buy me a coffee at the link below? Every coffee donation is a huge help to supporting the work I do, and it helps me get videos and other content out faster. Even the smallest donation can help keep this channel going. Thank you.